Marc Newson's work as a designer has touched, and indeed touches, the V&A at many points. Design art, postmodernism, one-off pieces that tell tales, Milan in a van, even Cold War modern, in that Marc has a love of the sets of Ken Adam for James Bond and Dr. Strangelove, something we share, and indeed for the spaceships of 2001. The chairs we're going to be sitting on for this conversation are, in fact, Marc's chairs for the Qantas first-class lounge made in Italy. And a big Manhattan collector of his work has said that the thing about his chairs is that not only are they beautiful and comfortable, but they make you feel horny as well. Well, time will tell, ladies and gentlemen. I'll let you know in 50 minutes. And talking of time, Time magazine recently named him, in one of those lists, one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Not designers, people. Will you please give a very warm welcome to Marc Newson. You've designed right across the spectrum, coat hangers to jet aircraft. We're going to see both. What's your line on specialists versus generalists? You know, there's one faction that says you should train a furniture designer, and that's what you do for the rest of your life. But you haven't done that. You've moved into all sorts of different areas. What do you feel about that?
Well, to begin with, I never trained really in a particularly specific way. I went to art school, and I decided to concentrate on jewellery, but I concentrated more on making jewellery rather than designing jewellery. So, and as you have pointed out, I've drifted across a very, very broad range. I mean, I think just about as broad as you could possibly be. I mean, there are not many things that I haven't tried to kind of address. Not because I want to address, or not because I want to tick all of those boxes, but because I think as a designer, really the métier is the same. And, you know, you're dealing with different materials, you're dealing with different scale, obviously. That's a big differentiator. Different processes, different materials, different techniques. But really that's, for me, what design is all about. It's being able to kind of, you know, learn from one area and sort of cross-pollinate, take the expertise that you've picked up from, say, designing a sneaker and apply it to, let's say, the luggage industry.
Mm. And would you say drawing is at the root of everything? Because you're famous for manically sketching all the time, ideas and show anything that comes into your head. Is that the root of it? Whatever you're doing.
I'm more comfortable certainly drawing than I am working on a computer. Let's put it that way. You know, I find that, you know, I'm very much a kind of, you know, I work in a pre-digital way. But my sketches are not the typical kind of designer sketches. You know, again, I didn't learn how to draw with sort of, you know, wonderful big sort of Pantone, you know, Pantone pens and things. You know, my sketches are like thumbnail sketches that I draw with, you know, with a fountain pen. And, you know, my drawing book is like a diary of ideas. So, but it's really just a means to an end. It's a way of recording ideas. It's not, you know, I don't chase ideas.
Yeah, yeah. The other big issue in design today is this in-house versus consultant. That, you know, most of my students at the Royal College, had the ambition to set up on their own as consultants and sell their services across the piece. And the idea of working in-house for a company is very unsexy, right, you know, for better or worse. And people like James Dyson always said, you know, it's more fun than it looks.
Unless you're Johnny Ive. You know.
Yeah, exactly. Johnny Ive for Apple is a very good example.
Very rare.
What do you feel about that? You've done both, okay? Well, in fact, you've worked for yourself, you've worked for companies like Alessi and Qantas, and you've worked on commission. You've done all of them. What's your take on that?
I've worked for big companies in a slightly different capacity, always as a consultant. So I've always managed to maintain my own, you know, sort of autonomousness, I guess. Mm. So, and interestingly, a lot of large organisations engage me when they have their own design team, and they find it somehow necessary that someone from outside of the design, outside of their sort of design world, right, can come and try to solve their design issues in a slightly different way. Look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I'd say one is kind of better than the other. I know what I'd rather be doing. I've never worked for anybody, on a sort of salaried basis, so I don't think I could ever do that.
But when you're doing Qantas, say,
Yeah.
so you're doing the interior of this, huge passenger aircraft, there's health and safety, there's bureaucracy, there's all sorts of things that come in, which, you're making a Lockheed Lounge, knocking it up in some workshop, is a very, very different experience. I mean, how much creativity is left when you do something like a Qantas aeroplane?
Oh, not much. I would say probably 5%.
No.
Never
Feels like more than that, actually. I would say, yeah.
Well, but this is terrestrial. So when you're in the air, designing aircraft seating, like this, for example, it's. There's not a hell of a lot you can do. I've done just about as much as I think as you could possibly do in a design like this.
Right.
Nevertheless, I think it's important to be done. I think it's far more important to do it in an aeroplane than it is on Earth, because people are obliged to spend extended periods of time in aeroplanes.
Yeah. It always looks so good in the brochure, do you know?
It does, yeah, I know. They took a few seats out to do that shot. Yeah.
Also, you've said, I'm a geek and all designers should be geeks. What do you mean by that?
Maybe I meant was all the designers I know are geeks. But
is it to do with how things work, taking things to pieces, having that sort of detailed sense of...
I think maybe when I sort of talk about being a geek, I talk about being sort of obsessional. And although I think I probably was in denial for a number of years, I now realise that I am truly obsessional. And I don't think that you can be really... design is good design for me is all about that. It's all about the detail, of course. It's all about how things are made. It's all about quality. It's all about production, materials, techniques. And you've really got to kind of be obsessed with all of those things in order to understand how they all work together.
Yeah.
And I just, I don't think you can be sort of sloppy with design. Everything's got to kind of mesh. Everything's got to work. Everything's got to fit together.
And it's a certain turn of mind about process and detail and how things come together. We'll get to your training a little bit later on about whether that was always the case and indeed when you were growing up. But let's start with the Lockheed Lounge, because this was the thing that made your name and has had this extraordinary afterlife. You'd graduated from Sydney College of Arts, having done jewellery, although eccentrically you exhibited furniture on a jewellery course.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the only reason I did jewellery, as I said before, was because, well, as maybe I didn't say before, I wanted to learn how to make things. And the art school that I went to, like most art schools really, was slightly esoteric. And they didn't really teach people how to physically do things. The only department, apart from sort of printmaking and ceramics, was the jewellery department. So that's why I did jewellery, because I could actually learn how to physically make things. I could learn how to weld. I could learn how to solder. I could learn the difference between brass and copper and stainless steel and mild steel. I could learn how to rivet. I could learn how to set stones. I could learn about real things. And that was really all I wanted to do. And I never made jewellery in the jewellery department, but I did make furniture. And I sold it to the lecturers because I was able to... Jewellery departments are usually pretty sort of odd places. They don't
tight, usually much tighter than that. They expect you to do jewellery. Yeah.
Well, my argument was that furniture's as much about the body as a piece of jewellery is. So, they bought that hook, line, and sinker.
Very convincing. Yeah.
It was big jewellery, really.
Yeah, yeah. And then you leave, and you sort of do various casual things. But the breakthrough is you get an exhibition at a gallery in Sydney.
That's right. Yeah.
And you made this Lockheed Lounge for it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you tell us? I mean, the process, because I gather it started off with cutting up foam, then you make a mould, and then you cover it in aluminium.
The whole process was something that I learnt. In a lot of it I learnt when I was studying the jewellery, but a lot of it I'd learnt before that, because one of the things about that you learn, Australia is very much about do it yourself. It's a kind of DIY culture, And in a lot of ways, it's a very kind of inventive culture, but you really have to do it yourself. There's really not that much industry that well, certainly nothing near. I mean, if I'd have been an Italian designer, I don't think I ever would have done this, because you know the amount of industry that you have at your fingertips there. But it was built a bit like a surfboard, and the actual internal shell was made in much the same way that you'd make a surfboard, which is to sort of carve a foam shape, cover it with fiberglass, and then you had kind of a rigid plastic form. And it was a very fast, it was a very immediate way of realising a shape, simply. I wanted the thing to look metallic, and the only way I could think of doing that was to cover it in tiny pieces of aluminium. I mean, they're as big as they could be, because I couldn't sort of physically get them to bend around a three-dimensional shape if they're any larger. They're all attached because they're all attached with rivets, because I didn't want to glue them, and that's kind of why the thing ends up looking the way it does.
Right, and then you chose the name Lockheed as a sort of industrial aviation reference.
Yeah, they still haven't contacted me about that, which is.
I think they will. Yes.
Yeah,
and lounge. It's interesting because in Australia, a lounge is a synonym for a sofa.
Yes.
It's interesting that, because I'd never come across that. Because over here, a lounge is like the living room.
Like a room, yeah.
Yeah.
There you
go. Because when I first read about the Lockheed, I thought he's designed a living room.
A
That's
room,
an interesting
yeah.
way to start. But
no,
the Lockheed Lounge.
Not even. Yeah.
So you have this exhibition, and about a year later, we're now in the mid-80s, you've got a wooden chair, Tasmanian oak, which you also, I think, exhibit.
Pine, actually.
Pine, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I designed, at that point in my career, I was really obsessed with the idea of designing and building furniture, because it seemed to me the perfect expression of, well, or maybe not the perfect, but a very logical expression of design. A lot of architects and designers had chosen the form of a chair, or used a chair as a sort of a medium with which to express an idea. And I thought, it was a great place to start.
Why is that, do you think? Why is it that designers always want to have a crack at a chair? I always used to say to the students, John would be interested in this, I always say, the students in the college want to have a go at a chair, and you think, gosh, there'd be so many bloody chairs. Why don't you do something else? But the chair is the big high ground you've got to have a go at.
Yeah.
In a funny way.
Perhaps it's because it's a sort of human invention. It's a sort of compromise between standing and lying on the floor. It's a kind of an essential object, like a wheel, in a way. But you're absolutely right.
It's the high ground. You're competing with the whole history of design when you take on a chair.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's why that's why I did it. I designed a number of chairs, 20 years ago, like this. A whole slew of pieces, trying to kind of address that very issue. But they were very much about form, as you can see, and materials. The wood chair, obviously, trying to use wood in a slightly interesting way. The embryo chair, the one that was before this.
Yeah. Felt, is that a Joseph Beuys reference?
It was originally, yes, because this chair was made of felt originally, and I subsequently made the same chair in fiberglass.
Yeah. There's a very funny thing. There was an Imagine TV program made last year about you, and you're in your apartment. And here's the felt chair, which is looking rather the worse for wear, because your cat's had a go at it.
That's right,
and if you have a felt chair, if you have a cat in the house and you have a felt chair, it's very, very tempting, I would have thought.
Absolutely.
Expensive mistake, that one, but anyway, yeah.
Disaster, yeah.
And a style begins to emerge through these chairs. This rounded, sort of organic but industrial look of the first phase of your career, I think.
Yeah. This kind of odd sort of hourglass shape, which I sort of refer to as my orgone shape. Yeah. I was inspired by Wilhelm Reich.
Yes.
And his kind of various orgone contraptions.
Yes. Well, I was mentioning about your chairs and their reputation earlier in the introduction.
Absolutely, yeah. Keep your socks on.
Yeah, it's not working yet, but anyway. But you did. Sometimes with these chairs, you do a sort of one-off piece for exhibition, and at that stage, and then a couple of years later, you do a batch model of it or a different version of it. You revisit it, so that it's well, say limited edition or anything, which is
Yeah.
quite interesting. You kind of revisit your own work, but in a different medium.
Yeah, there are these themes that sort of tend to reoccur, throughout my, well, for years really. I mean, this is one of the pieces that is, I guess, could be considered a piece. It's a sculptural piece of furniture, I suppose. That
I love the inside-outside thing with that.
yeah,
Where
well,
the
that's,
inside is very much part of the design as well.
yeah,
as
it
the
was
outside.
something that I was always particularly obsessed with in my work, and something I think I picked up when one of the things that maybe the only thing that I picked up when I was studying jewellery. And I designed a whole series of pieces that were, as much about the inside as they were about the outside.
Yeah.
But it's, again, it's the kind of obsession with detail and the obsession with the way things are made that really you would have to think as much, if not more, about the way things are built.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the things that you don't see.
Yeah.
That's a table. These pieces are all made from aluminium, which is a material, a metal that I particularly like using. But it's 1.4 millimeters thick. They're all they're completely made by hand and welded together, and kind of painstakingly built.
Mm.
But they came from production pieces, the production pieces that you saw before.
Mm. Which was the one which you put stretched fabric on, skin diving? The very thin skin diving material that gives that kind of.
This piece was the embryo chair, and it's again. I designed and built that when I was in Australia, and there weren't an enormous number of sort of interesting upholstery fabrics available, so I simply upholstered it in wetsuit fabric, which was commonly available.
Mm.
So it was very much about trying to, use materials and technologies and processes that were available.
Mm. But it adds to this sort of sleek, industrial, science fiction-y look that you were developing at that time, I think.
Yeah, probably sort of subconsciously as far as I was concerned. This was just the direction that I was headed, and I didn't really stop to think about, why I was doing it.
Yeah. And then the Qantas material, which we've seen. I mean, I read a thing a couple of years ago about how a lot of the great innovations in furniture design have come through cars and planes and even railway seats. That the ergonomic research that has to go into those has had a huge influence on, as it were, the civilian market. And certainly you have to think out the function of the chair in a much more direct way, I think, when you're dealing with, obviously, an aircraft cabin than you would have to when you're doing a sort of gallery piece.
Completely. I mean, yeah, there's absolutely no question that, there's it's 50 times more complicated to design something for an aeroplane than it is to design something, for a sort of terrestrial environment.
Yeah. And this is, I think, is this the only Australian client you've ever worked with?
Yes, ironically, yeah. Yeah. Sort of my biggest client and the only Australian client that I've ever had.
Yeah, because as we'll see, you worked in Tokyo, Paris,
Yep.
all sorts of London, all sorts of different places. Yep. But this is did they approach you or did you approach them?
They approached me originally, and to design the very first program that we worked on in 2002, which was what was referred to as a skybed. Then I actually won I won a sort of bidding process or a tender to design all of the interiors for this A380 aircraft, which was a project that lasted for about 7 years. And that's pretty much been the focus of my involvement with Qantas, designing really the entire interior of their fleet of A380s. And they have the second largest fleet of those in the world. They've got 22, so it's quite a big. Yeah, it was a mammoth task.
Yeah, and a brave thing for them to do in a way to entrust this incredibly complex design thing to you. I'm not saying that you hadn't shown, as we'll see, you've done other transportation projects, but it's a hell of a thing to take on.
It was a crazy thing for them to do in a sense. I mean, when you consider the kinds of people I was competing against, the sort of tried and tested designers that work in the industry. But we did it, and of course I have a team that I work with.
Yeah.
Not a huge team. We're about 10 people, somewhere between 10 and 12 people, sometimes more. But and we were able to work with Airbus, throughout this project. So, from the moment these aircraft didn't exist when we started working on them. They were very much on the drawing board.
Yeah. Let's move on to transportation then. There's an obvious link. The first thing you did, I think, in this area is the concept car for Ford.
Yeah.
Or one of the first, which is having its 10th anniversary this year.
It is. And
I think we should explain that this is a concept for a car which is sort of inspirational rather than a production model.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was, wasn't it, that giving you the idea of a car, and they'd send it over to Dearborn, to Ford, and it would inspire thoughts about car design, which is quite an interesting concept.
well, there's a a huge history of automobile manufacturers designing concept cars. It's what they do at the big car shows. They present their concepts. This actually works. I mean, it's a real, it's a functioning vehicle. However, it never went into production, so it'll always be a concept car. But yes, it was made for the. It was presented at the Tokyo Motor Show, and then it went to the Detroit Motor Show, and it kind of did the full. It did the full circuit of car shows.
And Jay Mays, the sort of creative director at Ford, said a very interesting thing about you. He said, in a world of sameness, you're different.
Well, I came up with this idea of the kind of
the boot coming out,
the
like
draw boot,
That's very nice.
Which was kind of partially ripped off by somebody, but not very well.
And the doors open, fanning out open.
Yeah, that
That's
of
nice.
course had been done before, but not on such a small car.
No.
It was an absolutely minuscule car. The wheelbase was smaller than the smallest wheelbase that Ford had, in their fleet. I even got to design the tyres at Pirelli, so
Gosh.
that's how kind of real it was. I mean,
Yeah.
the idea was
And the dashboard,
really.
what I love about the dashboard is there's hardly anything on it. Usually they look like some spaceship, but you've just got a couple of dials and a few knobs.
My kind of thinking here was to sort of demystify the whole. Cars are very complex. They've gotten increasingly more and more complex, and so I really wanted to try to.
Yeah, isn't that great?
But that's
So
all.
simple.
That's really all you need. The interesting thing about this concept was that it could be easily left and right-hand drive. There was actually there's very little tooling that has to be modified. That's the number of controls that you have.
No, I love that. And Joe Mays said that when it arrived, he said, why haven't people thought like that before? It was just one of those why not situations,
Yep.
really, that you'd done. So it certainly did its job, I think. In getting
Yeah, I mean, it
people
won.
thinking a certain way
It
about
won the car of the show at Tokyo, and where it was presented. So it was very well received.
And then the Falcon Jet, a business, sort of a private jet, and you did the interior of that.
Yeah, this was the first private jet that I designed. I've subsequently ended up doing a huge amount of work in the aviation industry, both commercial and private. But this was the first of several private jet interiors and liveries that I did. But this was, this was over 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
So it's ended up becoming the sort of mainstay of my business, really, designing aircraft, things to do with aerospace.
And that's everything, the seating, the carpets, the livery, the colour scheme.
Yeah, I mean, everything you can see on the inside.
Yeah. And then, very strangely, a concept jet. Now, this was new to me, that the Cartier Foundation, for whom you'd done, I think, a sculpture before, created a sculpture,
Yes.
asked you to produce a concept jet that's never going to take off, but shows off the Fondation Cartier. And I was reading, and you called it Kelvin, which is a reference to Solaris.
Well, reference to the scientist.
Yeah.
And to the film.
And to the film. There was a wonderful catalogue where the great French philosopher Paul Virilio, no less, I think this is really class, Mark, actually, wrote an essay about how you'd invented a whole new concept, the fictitious object, which looks like it's functional, but actually doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
And this was it.
And it took the Cartier Foundation to, commission the thing. It was a very, very bizarre project. I mean, I thought if the automotive industry can design concept cars, why can't the aviation industry design concept planes? I mean, there are a lot of good reasons why they wouldn't do that, but I thought, why not have a crack at it? I approached a number of aerospace companies, and they all kind of laughed at me. And I went to Cartier. Well, in fact, the Cartier Foundation had come to me and wanted to do an exhibition. And for years I couldn't think about what to do because, you know, the Cartier Foundation is very much a place that exhibits art, you know, and I'm a designer, so I was still sort of slightly at odds with that, that issue. And I said, well, why can't you help me to design my concept plane? And we'll exhibit it in an art gallery, and we'll make it all about the context of this object. Yeah. And they loved the idea. Subsequently, all of the aviation manufacturers came running and wanted to be associated with this. So people like Dassault, the French jet engine manufacturer, Snecma. I mean, it's got a real jet engine in it. And we did all of the wind tunnel testing.
It's such an extraordinary idea. It's a piece of engineering in an art gallery.
It was a fantastic...
yeah, no, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, and there's just some shots from the wind tunnel testing that we did.
Were you disappointed it never took off?
Well, I never really thought it would, to be honest with you. I mean, you know, you'd have to be kind of a crazy or a very rich person to want to kind of fund a project like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But it could have flown. You know, we did as much as proving it could fly. I mean, it was as good. You know, it was a virtual, real thing.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't need to prove that it could fly because I knew it would, because we did all these, you know, fantastic computer simulations at the largest aeronautic institute in France. Mm. And because I'd come from the Cartier Foundation, they did it all for free.
Fantastic. And then an even more ambitious piece of aviation, your suborbital rocket, the first piece of tourism into the zero gravity of outer space.
Well, not the first.
Isn't it?
Well, actually, no one's done it yet. No one's actually...
It's never actually gone up, but isn't it the first to have been designed?
It's never gone up. It's no. There are a number of suborbital concepts, space tourism sort of concepts that were launched simultaneously. Mm. Most of which have fallen by the wayside.
This is for EADS, the European Aeronautical Development
and Defence. Yeah.
Defence. Yeah.
More specifically, it's for. Here I can play you a little animation. More specifically for a company that's owned by EADS called Astrium. Astrium is the largest European manufacturer of launch vehicles, i.e. rockets. EADS also own Airbus. So they have unlike any of the other players in this industry, they have expertise in aircraft and rockets. Mm. So that's a kind of unique combination. And they approached me because of what they'd known about me in the aviation business, the aviation interior business, to design the interior of this thing. But I ended up designing more than that. I mean, this is a full-scale mock-up, but designing actually the entire exterior of the nose. In fact, it's everything from the rear pressure bulkhead forward. I mean, everything behind that is rockets.
And the interior, I mean, part of it is the seats that move as you go into these different atmospheres and as you take off and everything. So you never actually leave your seat during takeoff until you reach weightlessness.
Yeah, well, in fact, you can't. Yeah, right. I mean, you're experiencing a huge number of Gs.
Yeah, and then when you're weightless, those little yellow things to hold on to, you think of everything. Yeah. So everyone's floating around, and you can grab hold of these things.
Absolutely, you just kind of navigate yourself around the cabin. Yeah. The point about the way that these seats work is that most seats in aeroplanes are seriously heavily actuated, which means that there are a number of electronic motors, pneumatic mechanisms that move the seat in any particular direction. The risk for failure of any of those mechanisms is immense, and as I'm sure you know, that they often do fail. Yeah. If it failed in an environment like this, it would be kind of catastrophic. Mm. The other thing is, so what I did was devise this kind of hammock system, which essentially enables gravity, the weight of your body, control your orientation relative to the direction you're going in. So there are no actuators. So basically you're sitting in a kind of a hammock that tilts. The reason they're in that position is because I wanted to maximise the internal volume of the cabin. Because that's all you really care about when you're up, you're only up there for a number of minutes. And the last thing you want to be doing is kind of, bumping into seats when you're floating around.
You get great views too, actually. There's lots of windows, which I guess will be part of the trip when people do it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's all of Earth. Yeah. Ironically, the one thing that they probably won't remember when they get back to Earth is the interior of this. It's all about what's happening,
exactly.
outside. I mean, people just want to look out the window.
Have you booked your seat yet?
Well, yeah, I have. Absolutely.
Yeah, first time it goes up.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's just before we open it out to the audience, final section really, which is objects and interiors. Interiors, as Mark mentioned, you've done interiors for boutiques, hotels, shops, obviously departure lounges, and so on. And I thought it would be worth looking at one or two of those.
I've done a number of retail environments and hotel and things like departure lounges, commercial interiors. This was a very small project that I did for a fashion designer in Paris, and this is really more of a kind of what I would call a boutique interior. I mean, a lot of the way that I design interiors is really to think about them as objects rather than interiors. Rather than an architect would think about them, I think about them as the way an industrial designer would think about them. So, for example, this interior was built off-site completely and then shipped and assembled. So I knew exactly what it was going to be like. And that's a kind of very much...
What's the material?
Marble.
It's marble?
Yeah. Yeah, which is...
So you had it carved, you chose your marble and...
Well, I do a lot of the pieces that I designed and that were exhibited at the Gagosian Gallery. Sorry. This is against the rules. Yeah. Pieces like that are made out of a solid piece of marble.
Yeah. It's wonderful. I mean, imagining the block. And it was Carrara, wasn't it?
It's all Carrara.
Yeah.
I tell people that I've developed a way of thermoforming marble, and a lot of people believe that, which is
fantastic,
incredibly interesting. But then, there are other sort of slightly more ambitious interiors. For example, a very large lounge, which is where these chairs were designed.
Yeah.
Or what these chairs were designed for. This is a first-class lounge for Qantas in Sydney, and these have been rolled out in a number of other cities around the world. But this was the sort of flagship lounge, and it was actually a large construction that was built on top of the airport. And as you can see,
fantastically comfortable, actually.
Yeah, what's really cool about this is that you sit there and look out these windows, and the A380 parks up right underneath you. So you sort of go out and straight down and into the plane.
Yeah.
So it's very kind of George Jetson, but but a lot of fun.
And then finally, objects, things, right across the piece, from luxury items to these everyday things that I've described. Luggage, Samsonite.
Yeah, and I've worked with a lot of different companies like Samsonite, designing things like luggage and cookware, toilets, sanitary ware, shoes. I mean, you name it. But this was an entire range of products for Samsonite that were launched in 2004. I'm not sure if they're still available, but they were for a number of years.
You might have sold one or two in the audience tonight, actually. But yeah. What about your Nike Cosmonaut trainers?
Oh, there's a fun... Oops. So, in about 2000, I was approached by Nike to design to collaborate, really. People only ever contact me when they want to collaborate. They're never very specific about what they want to do. But in the case of Nike, it seemed kind of obvious. I'd been invited to Russia by the Russian Space Agency a number of times. I was absolutely obsessed with sort of Russian technology. And I designed these shoes for the cosmonauts that were going up about to go up in the International Space Station. And the idea is that they are Thank you. They're kind of convertible shoes. Basically, you wear the bootie when you're in the the inside of the International Space Station in a sort of a zero gravity environment where you're just kind of bouncing around. Because I witnessed sort of met cosmonauts and they basically said they just wear socks, which didn't seem very cool. But they also have to exercise a lot. Otherwise, well, obviously you exercise. In fact, exercising in space is much more important than exercising on Earth. Otherwise, your legs kind of drop off. And then I convinced, I sort of sold this idea to Nike that we should design shoes for the Russian cosmonauts, hence the name Zvezdochka, which is the name of one of the dogs that went into space. And hence this kind of convertible shoe. There's no glue used in the production of this shoe. The inner sole is held into this outer casing, just by the studs that sort of depress through the outer skin.
Are these still available?
They've just relaunched them actually in a sort of series of different colours, but they were never sort of widely. They didn't make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. I think they were sort of produced in their tens of thousands. Yeah. And unfortunately they never went into space because it was at the time when the Russians started taking space tourists up, and then there was a little bit of a rift developed between NASA and the Russian Space Agency, and Nike being an American company were forbidden by NASA to sort of endorsing any products that went into space.
Right.
But they may yet go up.
Let's whiz through mobile phone. Cult object now.
Yep, I'm still actually working on a number of mobile phones for only for the Japanese market, and well, it's here somewhere.
Where was it? Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
So this phone was launched in 2003 in a series of different colours. And at that time, well, this is before the iPhone, so long before the iPhone actually. And it was the first mobile phone that I developed, and it was only available in Japan. It only utilised Japanese technology, unfortunately. And it's still being used by people in Japan. It's become a bit of a cult object, actually. People still use these. And I was also able to sort of have fun with the graphic user interface.
Animals.
Yeah, you could choose this little sort of animal menu instead of, the sort of stupid icon that's supposed to describe something mechanical.
Yeah.
Or the male icon that is
What was the kangaroo?
represented
what
by.
What did the kangaroo represent?
Well, that's the thing. You had to kind of either read Japanese or memorize the animal.
System, I don't know. Yeah.
But I could navigate my way through, not reading kanji very well, just by remembering what the kangaroo did. So when you touched each one of these icons, they'd kind of do a 360 and spin. But that was kind of fun. But you can do that. You can do that in Japan.
Mundane object, coat hanger.
I've done lots of mundane objects, but
Just to represent all of them, really. Yeah.
a coat hanger design for an Italian company. I've worked with a lot of Italian companies, Italian manufacturers, as most designers like me have.
Yeah. And finally, before I go, your necklace, because at last you're designing jewellery, which you were trained for all those years before. And perhaps keep this on the screen while we...
Yeah, this was a sort of an unusual project. I was approached by Boucheron, who's a fairly well-known jeweller in Paris, to design something. Again, they wanted to collaborate, but weren't specific about what they wanted it to be. And I think they were expecting me to do some kind of a Fabergé kind of, object. But I thought, well, I think I'll just try and tackle jewellery head-on and design a piece of jewellery. And I've always been inspired, like a lot of designers, by fractal theory. And this is very literally inspired by a particular subset of the Mandelbrot set. And as you can see, it's a pretty complex piece. I think it's made from diamonds and sapphires. There's over 1,400 diamonds and sapphires. And it took them about 4 or 5 months to make.
Why Julia?
Well, the Julia is the name of the subset. It's called the Julia set.
Right.
and it was Julia is the surname of a French mathematician.
Right. You're very good at these titles, I must say. They
Yeah, I
carry
mean,
several meanings.
Julia is not quite as exotic as Mandelbrot, but
No, the Mandelbrot necklace, that would have been quite something.
yeah, I know.
Okay, let's now a chance for 5 or 10 minutes to ask some questions from the audience. And there's microphones wandering around. Who'd like to... Yeah, at the very back, there you are, having walked all the way down. The back there, in the middle.
Mark, nature versus nurture. As a creative, how much do you think you were born with, and how much do you think you learned? What's the percentage for you?
Did everyone get that? Yeah. Nature and nurture. How much was it in the genes, and how much through your environment, your design?
Perhaps 60-40, maybe, if I had to put a figure on it. Maybe 60% nature and 40 nurture.
Could it be less? Could you be born with a smaller amount and learn to do these type of things?
You mean could it be less nurture?
Could you learn that creativity, or do you think you have to be? It has to be something innate inside you.
Honestly, I think there's yes, you can certainly learn a lot, but I think there's a limit to how much you can learn about doing certain things. You can learn about materials, and you can learn about processes, and you can learn about techniques. But I don't know how easy it is to learn. In some ways, it'd be like asking, how easy would it be to learn how to be a painter? And I'm not sure how easy that would be.
It's in the genes, isn't it? Because we're going to talk about this a bit later, but your uncle and your grandfather were, by your account, real tinkerers, in the garage, taking cars apart, doing sort of home DIY, as you mentioned, DIY.
DIY, yeah.
Sort of Sydney DIY set.
Exactly,
and watching them as you were growing up, it was something you did just routinely, taking things to pieces, working out how they worked, and making materials do things. So that's in the genes, obviously.
That's, to a certain extent, I think that's in the genes, but, had I not been able to witness that taking place, I'm not sure if it ever would have been sort of nurtured.
Yeah. You didn't have a great art teacher at school?
No, in fact, I didn't.
Because usually people say, if it hadn't been for Miss Pross, none of this would have happened. But
I actually had a terrible art teacher in school, and I think that kind of drove me perhaps even further. Right. I hate to think what would have happened if I'd had a good art teacher, actually.
That's interesting. It might have constrained you, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it kind of developed a sort of healthy sort of disrespect for...
Yeah, and you've said that design is very often to do with frustration.
I think it's completely...
Finding things that don't work.
It's all about frustration, yeah. In fact, I think to a large degree creativity is a lot about, what you kind of don't like as opposed to what you like.
And that's a kind of bloody-mindedness in a way, it's part of it.
It's what kind of drives me to want to sort of do things, I'm surrounded by things that I kind of don't really like the look of. Objects,
Mark?
I was wondering about how important making was to your designing. I mean, you started as a maker.
Yes.
Was that kind of optional or a matter of chance? Or do you think it's really important to understand how things are made if you're going to be a designer?
I think it's absolutely essential, now more so than ever, because it's so easy to make in a virtual world now. I think that's it's potentially a dangerous thing. I mean, computers are a wonderful thing, a wonderful tool, but they're only a tool. And I place huge importance on the ability to understand how things work and how to build things. I think it's enormously important for designers to be taught how to make things.
So, would you say that art schools have headed off in the wrong direction? I mean, you said even when you were at art school that you had to kind of go into it, and that wasn't really yours in order to get your hands on making. And my impression is that art schools have moved since that time further away from making.
Perhaps, and I think perhaps there is a distinction between art schools and design schools, but certainly in design schools, I think that that there's perhaps more time could be spent teaching people how to make things, because it's most importantly you'll discover that as a designer when you confront industry for the first time. And, you know, you'll be very quickly sort of laughed off, you know, out of the factory if you don't know how something's done. It's very easy to be, you know, just kind of palmed off.
Yeah, yeah. And you seem to have this ability to find also, if you can't make it, to find people who can. For example, your panel beating. I mean, a lot of that metal, which you started off as riveting, but ends up as a single piece of metal, is the Aston Martin panel beaters, yes? You found
Absolutely,
them
yeah.
at Newport Pagnell.
Absolutely.
And they do a lot of that metal work. And to find, you know, this group of people who still do panel beating in that way, that can do really high-end bending of metal, which is what you were after all along.
Yeah.
That's a remarkable talent. You sniff them out. You find them all over the world, people who can do these things.
Well, it's really the fun part about what I do. You know, it is kind of all about, as I keep talking about, materials and processes and techniques. I mean, all of this stuff is out there. You know, it's interesting because people talk about new materials. And, you know, I'd love to know what a new material is, in a way. I mean, a new material in design is really a material that, for me, that's been taken out of one context and used in another. You know, that's kind of more new than
But you make things do improbable things, in a way. Metal does improbable things, but you find someone who can do it.
Yeah, well, and in fact, they've been doing it for, you know, close to a century.
Sure.
So
making DB4s and things.
Yeah, well, you know, long before that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, it's all about sort of industry and a lot about craft as well.
Yeah. Another question. Yeah, at the top there.
That was a very casual aside about working with the Russian space industry. How did you happen to just get into that? And what was the experience? Like, I was going to ask you about the experience or possible culture clash with large companies that had their own either design ethos or design departments. But the Russians can be quite difficult.
Well, no, in fact, I was obsessed with particularly obsessed with Russian sort of space technology, Russian technology in general, Russian aviation technology, aerospace technology, and Russian and the Russian Space Agency. So I went, and somehow when in Moscow, I was introduced to somebody that worked at the Russian Space Agency, sort of befriended them, and made a contact with a number of people in the Russian Space Agency, and they were very, very approachable. I mean, you couldn't do that with NASA. I mean, I think they probably thought that I was one of those people that was going to pay $20 million to go into space, and they were sort of humouring me. But I met one guy who worked for a company called Zvezda, and Zvezda is the Russian company that manufacture all of the EVA, you know, suits and basically space suits. They make all the Russian space suits. And he's the one that I got talking to about the shoes. And he said, yeah, that'd be fantastic. And the thing about the Russians is it's a can-do kind of attitude, and of course they're, you know, on a financial level, we're sort of slightly less fortunate, I guess, than the Americans. But when I suggested that I was working with Nike and that I could design a shoe that their cosmonauts could wear in space, I mean, they thought it was an absolutely fantastic idea.
In fact, there's a photo of you I've seen inside a chunk of the space station, not in the air, but down on Earth.
Yeah,
well, where you're chatting to one of the cosmonauts.
That was in Star City. Yeah, that's a replica of the. Well, it's actually a training module for the Mir space station.
Right.
And I was chatting to a guy called Sergei Krikalev, who's the cosmonaut that has spent the most time in space. So it was really an odd thing. So I still kind of pinch myself about that. I wouldn't call it a collaboration, but
yeah, it's being in the right place at the right time again.
Yeah, and I was invited to 3 launches in Baikonur of you know, the habitation module for the space station, the first crew for the International Space Station, and yeah, it was very interesting.
Another time for one more. Yeah, here we go.
I want to ask you who some of the artists and designers in the past are you particularly like?
Who are the artists and designers from the past that Mark particularly rates?
Well, certainly from the present, or recent past, someone like Johnny Ive from Apple. I'm a huge admirer of his work. Artists are slightly more difficult. I mean, I have a number of artists whose work I like, or movements that I like. Arte Povera, for example, is a favourite kind of period of mine. People like Piero Manzoni or Lucio Fontana. And
going back further in history, astute historians of art will have perhaps noticed that the Lockheed Lounge was distantly related to David's painting of Madame Recamier.
Yeah, well, that was
on her chaise longue,
loosely inspired by that
So
painting.
that's rather
yeah.
nice. I always think that David ends up as the Lockheed Lounge.
Well, one of the good things about going to art school is that you have to study art history, and you don't do that in design school. So
Yeah. And another one of your early pieces was a homage to a 19th century French cabinet maker.
absolutely, André Gros.
Right.
In a very literal homage. I mean, those two pieces were designed and built around the same time, 86, 87. And they were very much designed as sort of homages to, in one case, the work of a particular person, and in the case of the Lockheed Lounge, to a particular painting of David.
Yeah, yeah. And more recently we've talked about Beuys and the felt chair and so on. So it's quite a range. Yeah. Okay, can I ask you, Mark, just a couple of finishing up questions there. You've moved, as we've seen, from being a one-man band in the mid-80s in Sydney, doing your riveted metal in a sort of garage. We haven't talked about surfing, actually, but never mind. That's another
Good.
time.
Yeah.
To working for a major airline, where, as you say, you've got an army of people working with you and an army of regulations to navigate. In what sense do you still feel the author of your work, or do you feel at one remove from it now?
Yeah, no, I do. I feel completely, very much the author of my work. I don't feel that I've had to make too many compromises, and in any case, compromise is sometimes a necessary part of what I do. So I think, you know, I'd like to think I embrace compromise, but no, I feel quite content that I've, you know.
No, you do. I mean, it's a distinctive look that comes through absolutely everything that you do, but you somehow manage to keep that individuality in the most corporate of circumstances, which can't be easy. It must be a bit of a battle.
It is. It's a total struggle. It's always a struggle, especially with the more corporate clients. It can be kind of soul destroying, but it is really a constant struggle. I feel like I'm constantly fighting, but bizarrely they keep asking me. So it's funny you talk about surfboards, because I just remembered a surfboard that I designed for an exhibition that I had with Larry Gagosian a couple of years ago. I've never been a very good surfer, but I've always loved surfing. And I designed a surfboard for a guy called Garrett McNamara, and he does this thing called toe-in surfing. Have you heard of that? The biggest waves in the world, like 60-foot waves.
Madness, complete madness.
And I designed this surfboard with a particular process that I'd discovered making furniture. So I thought it would be quite fun. So that's the surfboard that I designed for him. So he's quite a nutcase, this guy. But he can only surf these waves on this surfboard because it's a solid, not solid. It's a nickel surfboard. It's made of an aerospace grade of a nickel cobalt alloy. And the reason is because any other surfboard would snap in half. So that was just quite a fun. There is music to this, but
I can imagine.
But that was a real life application of one of the kind of nutty the materials that I made.
Yeah.
One of my.
But there is this culture in Sydney, I imagine, of DIY surfboard makers and people who lovingly create these sort of surfaces on their surfboards, which is part of your formation.
Yeah, it is DIY by definition. I mean, the surf industry, surfboards are not manufactured. It's the wonderful thing. They've evolved, and they're still made by people in no longer in garages, but they're made in small batches.
Yeah.
Always by hand. So it's a. So I got to go and hang out with him I think this was in Tahiti, and just sit in a boat and watch the guys film him.
Absolutely astonishing.
It's much better with the music.
Well, no, it's pretty good. Finally, you've you've had studios in Sydney to start with,
Yeah.
then a small sort of garage in Herne Hill,
Yes.
then Tokyo,
Yeah.
then Paris, and now Paris and London.
Well, I did have a studio in Paris until last year, but now I'm solely based in London.
Right. So of all those environments that you've worked in, which is your favourite?
I think on a you know, all things considered, London's probably the best place that I've worked. I mean, it's by far and away the most practical. I mean, Paris is a great place to live and a very enjoyable place to be, but working there is not that easy on a kind of bureaucratic level. Tokyo, you know, is an incredible place, but you know, I was there a long time ago, about 15 years ago. So
Yeah, during the boom times.
yeah, in
Yeah.
fact, that's pretty much when I left.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Mark, it seems to me, I mean, having seen your work and talked to you and met you before, that you're operating on various frontiers of design, I think. Obviously, sculpture and function, exclusive and mass production, large and small, engineering and craft, art and design,
Yeah.
very complex and very simple. And it's a really interesting place you are, I think. You're sort of treading this line between all those things. And if you'll forgive me, I'm reminded of the lyrics of that deathless song, The Urban Spaceman, by the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. Some of you may remember that. I wake up every morning with a smile upon my face. My natural exuberance spills out all over the place. I'm the urban spaceman. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Well, can I just thank you both? Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Mark. I think London is very lucky to have you, and I hope you keep on fighting the good fight, because the range of designs is simply dazzling. Most importantly, the drinks are downstairs. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.